The heroine of our story today, Claire, was 45 years old, and she was absolutely certain of her quiet, well-ordered world, right up until the moment a single random word overheard in a line shattered that world into before and after. This is a story you will definitely want to hear to the very end. The word, partridge, was spoken softly, almost casually, in the stuffy air of the post office, which smelled of old paper and quiet desperation. I stood there, clutching a phone bell, mechanically staring at a faded public service poster, urging people to buy savings bonds. The line moved with the speed of a melting glacier, and I, like everyone else, was in a state of resigned hibernation. 45 is an age when you stop being surprised by the slowness of the world and your own dissolution within it. And it was then, from somewhere behind me, from amid the rustling of papers and soft coughs, that it fluttered out. "Look, our little partridge is here again." I didn't turn around, not because I was proud, but because the first thought that pierced my drowsy mind was laughably practical. What partridge? Are there birds in here? But then a giggle, as thin as a mosquito's whined, made it clear they weren't talking about feathered creatures. I froze, feeling a hot flush creep up my neck to my ears. With every fiber of my being, I could feel two curious gazes on the back of my head, on my not-so-new but still perfectly decent coat. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, scanning, evaluating, passing their verdict. Partridge. Why a partridge? I began to analyze frantically. I had nothing in common with that bird. I wasn't colorful or plump. If anything, I resembled a gray sparrow, thoroughly battered by life, but not broken. An ordinary woman, one of millions. My husband, Leo, an engineer at a large firm, a man as solid and silent as an old oak wardrobe. My son, Kevin, a slacker college student who cared only about his guitar and some flighty girl from his class. A 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, a small cabin of state, a week-long trip to Florida once a year. Everything was as it should be. No partridges, no exotic birds in our measured, predictable world. I walked home without seeing the road. The grocery bag with milk and bread bumped painfully against my knees, but I didn't notice. In the reflection of a shop window, I caught a glimpse of myself, a troubled face, pursed lips, frightened eyes. I stopped and stared. Maybe it was more obvious to others. My walk? I always tended to scurry when I was in a hurry. Maybe the way I tilt my head when I listen? Leo always said it made me look like a curious chick. A chick, but not a partridge. That was completely different. A cute, fluffy little thing is one thing, but a game bird, an object of the hunt, is quite another. The usual silence greeted me at home. Leo wasn't back yet. Kevin was apparently out somewhere too. I went to the kitchen, mechanically put the milk in the fridge, and sat on a stool. The word itched in my brain like a splinter. Who were those women? I hadn't even seen their faces. Neighbors? Leo's colleagues? Friends of friends? And the main question, was this the first time they'd said it, or just the first time I'd heard it? My entire 45-year life, which had seemed so solid and understandable, was suddenly covered in a web of cracks, and through them blew a draft of something humiliating, ridiculous, and completely unknown to me. Leo arrived. He came in silently, as always, placed his briefcase by the door, and went to the bedroom without a word. I heard him changing into his sweatpants and an old sweater. This ritual had been unchanged for 25 years. It was part of the foundation of our marriage, as unshakable as the evening news. It used to bring me comfort. Today, it infuriated me. He walked into the kitchen, took a pot of stew from the refrigerator and put it on the stove. "Hey," he said, not looking at me. "Hey," I replied, and my own voice sounded foreign. I looked at his broad back, at the thinning hair on his head, and desperately wanted to ask, "Leo, do I look like a partridge?" But I couldn't, because I knew his answer. He would look at me as if I were crazy, shrug his shoulders, and say his signature line, "Claire, don't be ridiculous." He always said that when I tried to talk about anything beyond domestic matters, about feelings, doubts, fears. Don't be ridiculous. 3 words that reliably walled me up in my solitude. We ate dinner in silence. Leo slurped his stew with gusto, his face buried in the newspaper. Kevin never showed up. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds of my new partridge life. I looked at the man with whom I had shared a bed for a quarter of a century, and for the first time, I truly saw him. He was a stranger, a complete stranger, who knew something about me that I didn't. And this knowledge, this nickname, was something he shared with some faceless, giggling women from the post office. They were in his world, and I was outside of it. I was an object, a topic of discussion, but not a participant. That night, I couldn't sleep. Leo snored peacefully beside me, turned towards the wall. I lay there, staring at the ceiling where the reflections of streetlights danced. A partridge? How absurd. How savagely, humiliatingly absurd. Tears rolled down my cheeks, but they weren't tears of self-pity. No, they were tears of rage. Rage at this quiet, settled life that had turned out to be a lie. At my husband, who was possibly laughing at me behind my back with others. At myself, for allowing myself to become invisible, a function, a piece of furniture that could be given a funny nickname. And in that nocturnal silence, to the peaceful snores of the man who had betrayed me, and I no longer doubted it was a betrayal, something inside me snapped. Something hard, angry, and very resolute. I would no longer be a gray sparrow, and I certainly wouldn't be a partridge. I would get to the bottom of this. I would find out who called me that and why. I would turn their cozy little world, in which I was cast as a funny bird, completely upside down. I would make them look at me, see me, Claire, a person, not a game bird. I didn't know how I was going to do it yet, but I knew one thing. My old life ended today in that line at the post office, and tomorrow, a new one would begin. And in this new life, I would have the last word, not them. I quietly got out of bed and went to the mirror. In the dim light, a determined, angry woman I hadn't seen in a long time stared back. "Well, hello there, Partridge," I whispered to my reflection, and for the first time in many hours, I smiled. The game was on. The decision made in a fit of despair in the middle of the night seemed just as grandiose as it was absurd in the light of day. So I'd find out. Then what? Cause a scene at the post office? Demand satisfaction from 2 cackling women? It would have been comical if it weren't so bitter. No, I had to be more subtle. I transformed into a detective, a regular Nancy Drew of the suburbs, whose only trophy was a grocery bag and whose primary weapon was a sense of humiliation sharpened to a razor's edge. The first suspect was, of course, Leo, my silent, dependable Leo. I began to watch him. It was a new and strange activity, observing the man you share a bed with as if he were a foreign spy. I analyzed his tone of voice on the phone. I tried to catch the hidden meaning in his everyday phrases. In the evening, as he settled down with his blueprints as usual, I came up behind him and, trying to sound as carefree as possible, asked, "Honey, do you guys at work give each other nicknames?" He didn't even turn around. The pencil in his hand continued to draw a perfect line. "What nonsense, Claire. We're not in kindergarten." "Well, you never know," I persisted, feeling like a complete fool. "Maybe you call a heavy guy Hippo or a tall guy Stretch." "It's an engineering firm, not a zoo." He cut me off, and I knew the interrogation had failed. The wall of his indifference was thicker than fortress walls. So I changed tactics. The post office became my target, the scene of the crime. I started going there every day on the flimsiest of pretexts. I mailed greeting cards to a distant cousin in Ohio, bought stamps for future use, or just stood in line to buy a single envelope. I became a regular at this temple of bureaucracy, and I think the stern woman behind the counter was starting to recognize me. I peered into the faces of other women, trying to identify the culprits, but they all blended into one faceless, tired mass. My investigation had hit a dead end. Salvation came from an unexpected source. My son, Kevin. He stumbled home late one evening, smelling of cigarette smoke and youth, and announced from the doorway, "Mom, can I get $5 till my next paycheck? I need new guitar strings." I automatically reached for my purse. And then it hit me. The younger generation, they see everything. They notice everything. They have their own unique perspective. "Kevin," I said, handing him a $10 bill, "keep the change. Just tell me honestly, do I remind you of anyone?" Kevin took the money and gave me a puzzled look from head to toe. "What do you mean?" "Well, maybe a bird of some kind?" I forced out, feeling myself blush again. My son frowned, chewing on his lip. I held my breath. Now he would say something important, something that would be the key to the mystery. "Well," he drawled, "maybe a penguin. When you scurry into the kitchen for a pot, it looks pretty similar. Why?" A penguin. That was something new. My personal menagerie was expanding. A partridge, a penguin. Who was next? An ostrich? I waved him away and, shrugging, he disappeared into his room, from which the mournful twang of an out-of-tune guitar immediately emerged. My despair reached its peak. I was ready to give up, to accept my partridge fate and move on, just trying to avoid the post office. But fate, or rather a domestic accident, decided otherwise. On Saturday, I started a deep clean, and while dusting the bookshelves in Leo's home office, I accidentally knocked a heavy engineering manual to the floor. A folded piece of paper fell out from between the pages. I picked it up. It was a list of his department's employees with their phone numbers. There were check marks next to some of the women's names, and next to one, Stevens, T., something was written in my husband's small, neat handwriting. I brought the paper closer to my eyes. My little hen. The floor fell out from under me, so that was it. It was all so banally simple and sordid. My quiet, dependable Leo was having an affair with some Tamara Stevens, whom he affectionately called his little hen. And I, his legal wife, through some misunderstanding, some mistake, had inherited the nickname Partridge from his colleagues, who were obviously aware of their romance. And they weren't laughing at me, but at him, at his secret that had long ceased to be a secret to anyone but me. A wave of self-pity, as sharp as broken glass, cut through my heart. I wasn't just a partridge. I was a blind chicken who for 25 years had seen nothing beyond her own kitchen table. The anger I had felt before was replaced by a cold, ringing emptiness. I carefully folded the paper, put it back in the manual, and placed the manual back on the shelf. I wasn't going to cause a scene. I wasn't going to demand an explanation. I was going to act. Leo didn't know it yet, but his quiet domestic Claire was dead. And in her place, a very different woman had been born. And this woman would no longer allow herself to be called a partridge or a hen. This woman was about to become the hunter. And the game in this hunt would be my unfaithful husband. The plan formed instantly. It was bold, theatrical, and completely out of character for me. But that's what gave me strength. I was no longer Claire, the quiet engineer's wife. I was the director of a small play in which my husband and his little hen were about to become the stars. The occasion was Leo's 50th birthday, a milestone demanding a proper celebration. Usually, we marked such events quietly, with family, but this time I insisted on a banquet. Leo, honey, why are we always so old-fashioned? I cooed, looking him in the eye with the most innocent gaze I could muster. We should invite your colleagues, our friends. Let's have a real party at a restaurant. Leo, who hated noisy gatherings, agreed with surprising ease. He probably thought it was a good way to atone for his guilt, which, in his mind, I knew nothing about. He even gave me a surprisingly generous amount of cash from his personal savings, and I dove into the preparations with enthusiasm. I booked a hall at the Grand View, a chic place for its time. I planned the menu. I bought myself a new dress, an incredible, provocative shade of violet. But the main event of my program was the guest list. I took that very paper from the manual and, while calling my husband's colleagues, dialed the number for Stevens, T, with a particularly racing heart. Tamara Stevens, hello. This is Leo's wife, Claire. We'd like to invite you to his birthday party. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then a hesitant, slightly guilty voice replied, "Oh, Claire, thank you, of course, but I feel a bit awkward." "Nonsense," I chirped. "Leo will be so happy to see you. He talks about you so much. You simply must come." I hung up the phone with a deep sense of satisfaction. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the mouse to walk into it. The day of the party arrived. Leo, in a new suit, looked nervous and solemn. I, in my violet dress and an elegant updo, felt like an actress before her debut. The guests arrived. Leo's colleagues shook his hand, gave him gifts, and made banal toasts. I fluttered between the tables, smiling, keeping one eye on the entrance. And then she appeared. Tamara Stevens was the complete opposite of the image I had painted in my mind. Not a predatory homewrecker, but a small, frightened woman in a modest gray dress with a sad-looking perm. She looked like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into an eagle's feast. She shyly handed Leo a small bouquet of asters and mumbled her congratulations. Leo turned beet red and shot a terrified glance at me. I, on the other hand, beamed. "Tamara, dear, I'm so glad you could make it. Please have a seat." The evening proceeded as planned. Guests ate, drank, and danced. I waited for my moment. It came when the MC, a portly man with cheap jokes, announced, "And now a few words from the loyal life partner of our birthday boy, his muse and the keeper of his hearth, Claire." I stood up, clinking my glass. All eyes were on me. Leo looked anxious. Tamara Stevens seemed to shrink into her chair. "Dear friends, I began, my voice surprisingly steady. Today, we honor my dear husband. He's a wonderful man, an excellent professional, but few people know that Leo has a secret passion. He's an avid ornithologist. Yes, a bird lover. A confused murmur went through the room. Leo stared at me as if he'd seen a ghost. All his life, he has studied their habits, their calls, and he extends this tender love for our feathered friends to people, especially the wonderful women who surround him. For instance, me. I paused, sweeping the room with a triumphant gaze. He affectionately calls me his penguin for my graceful, shall we say, waddle. The guests laughed. Kevin, sitting at a far table, choked on his sandwich. Leo looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. But there are more exotic specimens in his collection, I continued, raising my voice. There is one little bird he treasures above all others, his muse, his inspiration, his little hen. Tamara, this toast is for you. I raised my glass toward the petrified Miss Stevens. A dead silence fell over the hall. Everyone looked from me, to the crimson-faced Leo, to his mistress who had turned paler than the tablecloth. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And then suddenly, in that ringing silence, one of Leo's colleagues, who was quite drunk, couldn't hold it in and snorted. Then another one giggled, and a moment later, the entire room erupted in laughter. It wasn't a malicious laugh, but a hysterical, liberating one. They were laughing at the absurdity of the situation, at the pathetic sight of the lovers, at my insane but brilliant performance. I set my glass down on the table and, without looking at anyone, walked towards the exit. I could feel dozens of eyes on my back, but I didn't care. My show was a success. Curtain. I didn't go home that night. I walked the streets aimlessly, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. My violet dress billowed in the wind, and it felt like I had wings. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew for certain that things would never be the same. I stayed the night at an old school friend's house, giving her a brief summary of the situation, omitting, of course, the salacious details about the birds. Without asking questions, she made up the couch for me and poured me a cup of chamomile tea. I returned home the next day. The apartment greeted me with a profound silence. Leo was gone. A note lay on the kitchen table. Claire, we need to talk. I'll be back tonight. L. I smirked. Of course we needed to talk, only this time I would be the one talking. I didn't pack his bags and leave his suitcase by the door like they do in bad movies. Instead, I did something I think I'd been dreaming of my whole life. I went into Kevin's room. He was sitting on his bed, hugging his guitar, and looking at me with silent sympathy. Mom, you okay? Never better, sweetie, I said. Teach me. Teach you what? He asked, confused. How to play. Show me the 3 easiest chords. We spent the whole day with that guitar. My fingers, accustomed to chopping vegetables and doing laundry, fumbled awkwardly with the strings. It sounded awful. But I was laughing. For the first time in a long, long time, I was laughing genuinely, to the point of tears. Kevin looked at me warily at first, then he started laughing too. We were like 2 conspirators who had found a secret refuge in the buzzing sounds of an old guitar. Leo came home in the evening, quiet, gaunt, looking 10 years older. He sat in a chair across from me and was silent for a long time. Claire, I'm sorry, he finally managed to say. I don't know how it happened. It was a moment of weakness. I looked at him without hatred, only with pity and a little surprise. How could I have lived with this weak, strange man for a quarter of a century? It's not about her, Leo, I said calmly, strumming the strings. The guitar made a false, jarring sound, and it's not about me. It's about the fact that we stopped seeing each other a long time ago. To you, I was just a piece of the furniture, convenient, familiar, and to your colleagues, I was a partridge. He flinched at the word. That that was a stupid joke because of your new polka dot coat. What difference does it make now, Leo? I smirked. You should thank them. If it weren't for them, I would have lived my whole life thinking I was nothing more than a pot of stew. But as it turns out, I can do this. I hit the strings again. We didn't get a divorce. It wasn't really the done thing back then, and besides, there was no need. We just started living differently, like roommates in a large apartment. He no longer tried to peer into my soul, and I didn't try to peer into his. That Tamara Stevens, as I later found out, resigned the very next day and vanished from the radar. And me, I kept learning to play the guitar. Then I joined a choir at the local community center. It turned out I had a decent voice. I bought myself another dress, bright red this time. I started going to the movies by myself and out for ice cream. I started to live. Sometimes, when I see women my age on the street with the same tired eyes and grocery bags, I see my former self in them, and I feel an urge to go up to each one and say, "Excuse me, but do you happen to know if you have a nickname? Some silly name that could be your ticket to a new life." The word partridge no longer caused me any pain. On the contrary, I was grateful for it. When you think about it, a partridge isn't such a bad bird. It doesn't soar majestically like an eagle or sing sweetly like a nightingale. It just lives its life on the ground. It scurries, fusses, raises its chicks. But there comes a moment when, either to escape danger or simply following an instinct, it suddenly bursts into the air and flies. Not high, not gracefully, but it flies. And in that short, desperate flight lies the entire essence of its bird soul. I took my flight too. And maybe it was short and looked ridiculous from the outside, but I was flying. And I wouldn't trade that feeling of flight for any quiet, cozy family nest in the world. Because it's better to be a ridiculous flying partridge than an invisible gray sparrow doomed to sit on the same branch for its entire life. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, and you'll hear even more captivating stories.